somewhere between legend and laboratory, between the ancient harbor of Syracuse and a sun-drenched waterfront in Athens in 1973, a quiet Greek engineer named Ioannis Sakkas did something that most scientists told him was impossible. He gathered 70 men, handed each of them a mirror, aimed them all at the same wooden boat floating 200 feet away, and watched it burst into flames, proving in one blinding, scorching moment that the most famous weapon in the ancient world was not a myth, not a metaphor, not an exaggeration carved into stone by admirers who had never witnessed what concentrated sunlight could actually do to the hull of an invading warship. If you are watching this video right now, I want you to drop a like and subscribe to the channel so we never lose each other. This kind of story is exactly why this channel exists. And before we go any further, I want to ask you two things directly. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your country in the comments below, because this community spans every continent, and I genuinely want to know. And second, what topic do you want me to cover next? Ancient Greek engineering, Roman siege weapons, the lost technologies of the Byzantine Empire? Tell me in the comments, and the most requested topic becomes our next video. Now let us go back to the beginning, because the story of the heat ray does not begin with Archimedes, and it does not end with Sakkas, and the truth of what happened in between is far stranger and far more dangerous than anything you have been told. Long before the philosophers walked the agora, long before the triremes cut through the Aegean like bronze knives through dark water, the land we now call Greece was already alive with the fingerprints of human ambition. Around 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, the first Neolithic farmers settled the fertile plains of Thessaly in what is now northern Greece, planting wheat and barley, and building rectangular mud brick houses in small, tight-knit communities that archaeologists have only begun to fully understand. These were not primitive wanderers stumbling blindly through history. By 650 BCE, the people of Sesklo in Thessaly had built one of the most organized proto-urban settlements in all of Europe, complete with differentiated housing structures, suggesting something remarkably close to social hierarchy. And by 32 BCE, the Bronze Age Cyclotic culture was producing abstract marble figurines of such precise geometric beauty that 20th century artists like Pablo Picasso and Constantin Brancusi openly admitted they were inspired by them, which means that the artistic genius of ancient Greece did not begin with Athens. It began in the islands, in silence, with people who left no written language, but whose hands knew something about beauty that the rest of the world was still centuries away from grasping. The first great civilization to rise on Greek soil was not Greek at all, at least not in any sense that the later classical Athenians would have recognized. Around 270 BCE, on the island of Crete, a people we call the Minoans began building something extraordinary. something that had no precedent in the Greek world and very few rivals anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. Under the leadership of a dynasty we associate with the legendary King Minos, a name so powerful that it attached itself permanently to the entire civilization. The Minoans constructed elaborate palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and Zakros, multi-story administrative and ceremonial centers so large and so labyrinthine in their internal layout that later Greek storytellers, encountering their ruins centuries after the civilization had collapsed, invented the myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur to explain what they were seeing. Knossos alone covered more than 150,000 square feet, contained over 1,000 rooms organized around a large central courtyard, featured indoor plumbing with clay pipes that carried fresh water and removed waste, and was decorated with vivid frescoes depicting blue-skinned men carrying vessels, athletic young people leaping over the backs of charging bulls, and women in elaborate, flounced dresses that look, to modern eyes, strikingly similar to something you might see on a fashion runway in Milan. And the civilization that produced these images reached its full power around 1700 BCE, when the palaces were rebuilt after an earthquake with even greater sophistication than before, suggesting a people not broken by disaster, but energized by it. The single greatest achievement of the Minoan civilization was not its art and not its architecture. As magnificent as both were, it was its economic system. The Minoans were the first true maritime trading empire in the Aegean, and at their peak, around 1600 BCE, Minoan merchant ships carrying pottery, olive oil, bronze tools, and the famous Minoan textile dyes were docking at ports from Egypt and the Levant in the east to Sicily and the Italian peninsula in the west, creating a web of commercial relationships so extensive and so profitable that scholars today refer to the Bronze Age Mediterranean economy as essentially Minoan-dominated. The palace complexes served not just as royal residences, but as economic redistribution centers. Farmers and craftsmen brought their surplus goods to the palace. Scribes recorded everything on clay tablets in a writing system we call Linear A that we still cannot fully decipher. And the palace redistributed goods according to what appears to have been a sophisticated bureaucratic system. The Minoans did not just trade. They created the infrastructure of trade itself, establishing the first Aegean standard weights and measures, and the first network of regularly maintained harbors specifically designed for commercial shipping. And somewhere in the vast storerooms of Knossos, beneath jars of olive oil and bolts of dyed cloth, the seeds of what would eventually become the classical Greek economic miracle were quietly germinating. Then, around 1450 BCE, something happened to Crete. The palace at Knossos survived while every other Minoan palace was destroyed, which tells archaeologists that this was not a natural disaster, but a conquest. And the conquerors left behind evidence of their identity in the form of a new writing system, Linear B, which we can read, and which turns out to be an early form of Greek, the Mycenaeans, a warrior civilization from the Greek mainland, centered on the massive fortified city of Mycenae in the Peloponnese, had arrived. And with their arrival, the entire character of Aegean civilization shifted from the relatively peaceful, trade-focused Minoan model to something harder, more militaristic, more obsessed with weapons and walls, and the glorification of violence in combat. King Agamemnon, or whoever the historical leader was behind the legendary name, ruled a Mycenae that covered an area of about 32,000 square meters and was surrounded by walls built from stones so massive, some weighing as much as 100 tons, that later Greeks called this style of construction cyclopean because they genuinely could not believe that ordinary humans had built it, and assumed it must have been the work of the mythological one-eyed giants. The Lion Gate at the main entrance to the citadel, built around 1250 BCE, features a massive stone relief showing two lions rearing up against a central column, the earliest monumental stone sculpture in all of Europe. And it announced to every visitor, friend, or enemy that the people who lived behind these walls were not merchants counting jars of oil, but warriors who wanted you to know, immediately, viscerally, the moment you approached their city, that they were the apex predators of the Aegean world. Inside the citadel, archaeologists have found the famous shaft graves containing warrior burials so rich with gold masks, bronze swords, amber beads, and inlaid daggers that, when Heinrich Schliemann first excavated them in 1876, he sent a telegram to the King of Greece declaring that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon, a claim that was historically wrong but emotionally entirely understandable, because the sheer concentrated wealth buried in those graves spoke of a civilization that had captured something enormous from the world and pressed it into gold. The single greatest achievement of the Mycenaean civilization was arguably the Bronze Age network it created across the eastern Mediterranean. A network so interconnected that when the system began to collapse, it collapsed everywhere at once. Mycenaean palace tablets in Linear B record transactions with Egypt, Cyprus, and the Hittite Empire. And Mycenaean pottery has been found in deposits across the ancient Near East, Italy, and the Levant, suggesting that by 1300 BCE, the Mycenaeans had essentially inherited and expanded the Minoan trading empire they had conquered, adding to it a military dimension that made them feared as well as sought after. Linear B tablets from Pylo's record extraordinarily detailed bureaucratic information, lists of land tenure, rowers being conscripted for naval service, women workers, and their children listed by name and occupation, giving us our first real window into the administrative complexity of a Greek-speaking civilization and revealing, with startling clarity, that the Greeks were bureaucrats and record keepers long before they were philosophers and dramatists, and the records they kept suggest a society so internally organized that a single palace could mobilize hundreds of ships and thousands of men for an expedition across the Aegean, which is, of course, exactly what the Iliad says happened. Yet the collapse, when it came, was catastrophic beyond anything the Mycenaeans had prepared for. Between 1,200 and 1,150 BCE, in a period scholars call the Late Bronze Age collapse, virtually every major civilization around the eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or suffered such severe disruption that centuries of accumulated knowledge, trade networks, and administrative sophistication simply evaporated. Mycenae itself was destroyed around 1,200 BCE, and the Linear B writing system, the first Greek writing, disappeared so completely that when the Greeks eventually reinvented writing 3 centuries later, they had to borrow the alphabet from the Phoenicians and start over from scratch. What caused the collapse remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The most compelling current theory involves a perfect storm of climate-driven drought, internal rebellions, disruption of the complex Bronze Age trade networks, and the attacks of the so-called Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders who appear in Egyptian records as a terrifying force, destroying everything in their path. What is certain is that the world that emerged from the wreckage of the Bronze Age collapse was darker, simpler, and more violent than anything that had preceded it. And it was from this darkness, this centuries-long silence, that the classical Greece we think we know would eventually struggle, improbably, magnificently, into the light. With the fall of the Mycenaean world, the stage was cleared for a period so obscure that historians literally call it the Greek Dark Ages, a 300-year silence during which population collapsed. Long-distance trade ceased almost entirely. Monumental architecture disappeared, and the art of writing itself was forgotten, as if civilization had exhaled and not yet breathed back in. It was in the depths of this darkness, somewhere around 800 BCE, that a blind poet, or a series of poets working in the tradition of a single legendary blind poet named Homer, sat down and began reciting the Iliad. We do not know exactly when the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed in their written forms, but the scholarly consensus places the text's final crystallization around 750 to 700 BCE. And what matters for our story is not the date, but what the act of composition represented. Greece was waking up. The rediscovery of writing, borrowed from the Phoenician alphabet, and adapted with tremendous ingenuity to capture the sounds of the Greek language, was not merely a technological development. It was a civilization declaring its intention to remember itself, to record itself, to think about itself in a way that required permanence and precision, rather than the fluid, improvisational oral tradition that had sustained Greek culture through 300 years of illiterate poverty. The archaic period of Greek history, running roughly from 800 to 500 BCE, was the era in which Greece reinvented itself from the ground up. And the speed and ambition of that reinvention remains genuinely astonishing. The Greek city-states, the polis, emerged as the fundamental political unit of Greek life, each one fiercely independent, each one developing its own laws, its own governing structures, its own particular genius for some aspect of human organization or creation. Athens, under a series of lawgivers of whom Draco in 621 BCE, and Solon in 594 BCE, are the most famous, experimented with increasingly sophisticated systems of law and government that would eventually produce democracy. Sparta, under the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, at a date the Spartans themselves could not precisely pin down, but which tradition places around 800 BCE, created one of the most radical social experiments in human history, a militarized society in which every male citizen was a full-time professional soldier. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 for military training. Girls were educated in athletics and physical fitness so they could produce strong children. And the entire economic system was sustained by a population of enslaved people called the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans by perhaps 7 to 1, and whose perpetual threat of rebellion ensured that Spartan society could never fully relax its militaristic discipline. Not for a single generation, not for a single year. The greatest achievement of the archaic period was the invention of the Greek alphabet and the literary tradition it enabled. But it was not only literature. The archaic Greeks invented the hoplite phalanx, the disciplined formation of heavily armored infantry soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their overlapping shields creating a wall of bronze that was genuinely revolutionary in the history of warfare. They invented the trireme, the fast, sleek warship propelled by 170 oarsmen, arranged on 3 levels, that would become the dominant naval weapon. Ways of thinking to every corner of the known world with a diaspora energy that prefigured European colonialism by 2,000 years. And in the gymnasia, the wrestling schools, and the sanctuaries of Olympia, where the first Olympic Games took place in 776 BCE, under a tradition so sacred that warring city-states suspended their conflicts to allow safe passage for athletes and spectators. The archaic Greeks created the concept of athletic competition as a form of civic and religious expression. The idea that the perfection of the human body in motion was itself a kind of worship, a demonstration of divine favor that no temple built of stone could quite replicate. But it was also in the archaic period that the Greeks first encountered the force that would define the next century of their history and ultimately produce the conditions from which Archimedes himself would emerge. Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great, who rose to power in 559 BCE and conquered the Median Empire by 550 BCE, then crushed the fabulously wealthy Lydian king Croesus in 547 BCE, and captured Babylon in 539 BCE. The Achaemenid Persian Empire assembled the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Central Asia to the borders of Egypt, encompassing dozens of distinct peoples and languages and traditions under a single imperial administration of remarkable sophistication. When Cyrus's successors turned their attention westward toward the Greek cities of Ionia, the Greek-speaking coastal cities of what is now Western Turkey, the collision between the Persian imperial world and the Greek polis world became inevitable, and the sparks from that collision would illuminate the history of the entire Western world for the next 2.5 millennia. The Ionian Revolt of 499 BCE, in which the Greek cities of Ionia rose up against their Persian overlords and appealed to mainland Greece for help, was the trigger. Athens and the tiny city of Eretria sent ships and soldiers, and together they marched inland and burned Sardis, the Persian regional capital, before the revolt was suppressed by force. Darius I, the Persian great king who was then at the height of his power, did not forget. It is said by Herodotus, the father of history, who may be taking some liberty with the drama, that when Darius heard of the Athenian attack, he called a servant to him and instructed the servant to repeat 3 times each evening before dinner the words, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether or not Darius issued this instruction, the sentiment behind it was entirely real, and the consequences were entirely real. And when the first Persian expeditionary force arrived on the Greek coast in 490 BCE, it was the beginning of a conflict whose reverberations would eventually produce, 2 centuries later, in a besieged city on the coast of Sicily, the most famous weapon in the history of ancient technology. Then from the east, those Persian forces arrived at Marathon in 490 BCE. And what happened next changed everything. The Battle of Marathon in September 490 BCE is one of those events in human history that functions as a genuine hinge point, a moment where the direction of everything that followed genuinely could have gone differently, and the difference in what might have been and what actually happened is almost too large to fully comprehend. Darius, I sent a force of perhaps 25,000 soldiers. Modern estimates vary, but the Persian army was unquestionably vastly larger than the Athenian force opposing it. To land on the plain of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens, with the intention of punishing the city for its role in the Ionian Revolt, the Athenians, under the strategos Miltiades, who had actually lived in the Persian Empire and understood Persian military tactics better than any other Athenian commander, met them with an army of approximately 10,000 Athenian citizen soldiers. contingent of perhaps 1,000 allies from the small city of Plataea, and on a morning whose exact date we cannot fix, but which almost certainly fell in early September, Miltiades ordered his men to charge at a run across the plain directly into the Persian lines. The result, an Athenian victory so decisive and so unexpected that the messenger Phidippides ran 26 miles back to Athens to announce it, collapsing dead after delivering the news, and thereby inadvertently creating the modern marathon race, sent a shock through the Greek world that its people never entirely recovered from. The Persians were not invincible. The greatest empire in the world could be defeated by a free people fighting for their own soil. The citizen soldiers of Athens, men with property and families and votes, men who had chosen to be there rather than been conscripted at sword point, could outfight the professional warriors of Persia. This was not just a military victory. It was an ideological revelation, and Athens, which had contributed the most to the victory, emerged from Marathon with a sense of its own special destiny that would fuel a century of extraordinary cultural and intellectual achievement, the likes of which the world has not since replicated. But Darius was not finished, and his son Xerxes I, who succeeded to the Persian throne in 486 BCE after Darius died, before he could launch his revenge expedition, was even more determined to destroy the Greeks. Xerxes' invasion of 480 BCE was not an expeditionary force like the one that had failed at Marathon. It was the full mobilization of the Persian Empire's military power, the largest army and navy that the ancient world had ever assembled in a single campaign. Ancient sources give numbers so large they strain credulity. Herodotus claims an army of 2 million, which is certainly an exaggeration, but modern scholars estimate a force of perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 soldiers, supported by a fleet of perhaps 1,200 warships crossing from Asia into Europe on a bridge of boats lashed together across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Turkey and Greece, while a canal was dug through the peninsula of Athos in northern Greece to allow the fleet to bypass the dangerous headland where a previous Persian fleet had been destroyed in a storm. The sheer engineering ambition of the project, bridging the Hellespont with boats, digging a canal through a mountain, announced that Xerxes intended to match his father's score not with an expedition, but with an act of world historical domination. The Greeks, at least those who chose to resist, because a significant number chose instead to submit, organized their defense around 2 key choke points: the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in central Greece, where a small force could hold a much larger army at bay, and the straits of Artemisium, where the Greek fleet could fight on terms that negated the Persian numerical advantage. King Leonidas I of Sparta, one of the 2 Spartan kings jointly ruling the city in 480 BCE, led the Greek land force at Thermopylae. The number 300 refers specifically to the Spartan royal bodyguard, the Hippes. But Leonidas commanded a total force of approximately 7,000 Greek soldiers from various city-states, still vastly outnumbered, but positioned in a pass so narrow that the Persians could not bring their numbers to bear. For 2 days, Leonidas's force held the pass, inflicting casualties on the Persian army at a ratio so grotesque that Xerxes, watching from his golden throne set up on the hills above, was reportedly driven to leap 3 times from his seat in agitation. And this detail, preserved by Herodotus, tells us something important. The Greeks at Thermopylae were not performing a suicidal gesture. They were functionally destroying a significant portion of the Persian army's finest troops, and doing it with a relatively tiny force, and the Persians knew it, and it terrified them. The betrayal of Thermopylae by a Greek named Ephialtes, who showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to encircle the Greek position, ended the battle not with a Persian military breakthrough, but with a Greek strategic decision. Leonidas dismissed the bulk of his force. Most of the 7,000 survived and remained with his 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans to cover the retreat. The last stand at Thermopylae, in which Leonidas and all his Spartans died fighting in a grove, surrounded and attacked from both sides simultaneously, produced one of the most celebrated moments of defiance in the history of the world. And the epitaph carved on the stone monument erected at the site afterward became one of the most famous sentences in any language. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The sacrifice bought time, not victory, but time in the summer of 480 BCE was everything. The greatest achievement of this era of resistance was the Battle of Salamis in September 480 BCE, which is arguably the most consequential naval battle in the history of the ancient world. The Athenian general and statesman Themistocles, who had spent years building up the Athenian fleet in preparation for exactly this crisis, lured the Persian armada into the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast, where the Persian numerical advantage became a liability rather than an asset. In the confined waters of the strait, the faster and more maneuverable Greek triremes could attack individual Persian ships without the rest of the Persian fleet being able to intervene effectively. And the result was a Persian naval catastrophe. Hundreds of Persian ships were rammed, capsized, or driven onto rocky shores, and the Persian fleet was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Xerxes, watching the battle from his throne on the shore, witnessed the annihilation of his naval power and understood immediately what it meant. Without a fleet to supply and support his army, maintaining 150,000 men in Greece was impossible. He retreated to Asia, leaving a substantial army under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. And when that army was destroyed at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE by a combined Greek force under the Spartan regent Pausanias, the Persian wars were effectively over. Greece was free, and the lesson was terrifyingly clear. If you gave Archimedes enough time to think, you gave civilization itself a chance to survive. It was at this moment that Athens, intoxicated by victory, enriched by the silver mines at Laurion, led by the greatest democratic politician the ancient world ever produced, entered its golden age. Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics from roughly 461 BCE until his death in 429 BCE during the devastating plague that struck Athens in the first years of the Peloponnesian War, channeled the tribute money of the Delian League, the defensive alliance Athens had organized among the Aegean city-states after the Persian Wars, into the most ambitious building program in the history of the ancient world. The Parthenon, completed in 432 BCE atop the Acropolis, was not merely a beautiful building. It was a statement of civilizational confidence, so overwhelming that its proportions and its sculptures still stop people cold 25 centuries later. The Athenian playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes were producing their works in the theater of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis. The philosopher Socrates was walking the streets asking uncomfortable questions. The historian Herodotus was reading his histories aloud at the Panathenaic festival to audiences who understood that they were witnessing the birth of something new. The idea that the past could be investigated, that causes could be traced, that human events had human explanations, that a sufficiently curious mind could uncover. Yet the Peloponnesian War, the 27-year conflict between Athens and Sparta, and their respective allies that began in 431 BCE and ended with the Athenian surrender in 404 BCE, proved that victory over Persia had not resolved the fundamental tensions within the Greek world, but had instead temporarily suppressed them while creating new ones. Sparta, jealous of Athenian power and alarmed by the growth of the Athenian Empire, allied itself with Corinth and other city-states to form a coalition against Athens. And the war that followed was so brutal, so prolonged, and so destructive of the values both sides claimed to be defending, that by the time Athens finally surrendered, the Greek world as a whole had been fundamentally damaged. Its population reduced by plague and war, its citizen soldier class depleted, its treasury exhausted, and its moral confidence shaken in ways that would never fully heal. The playwright Euripides, writing during the war, began questioning the heroic values that had sustained Greek identity since Homer, putting into the mouths of women and slaves and foreigners arguments that his audiences found profoundly disturbing precisely because they were so difficult to refute. And his Trojan women performed in 415 BCE just as Athens was launching its catastrophic Sicilian expedition, remains the most powerful anti-war drama ever written in any language, in any era. The Sicilian expedition, in which Athens sent its largest fleet ever assembled, more than 130 triremes, and perhaps 40,000 men, to conquer Sicily, ended in total catastrophe in 413 BCE. The entire expedition destroyed, and Athens never fully recovered. This instability continued until the final Spartan victory of 404 BCE produced not liberation, but a new kind of tyranny. As Sparta installed the 30 tyrants in Athens and Greek city-states across the Aegean, discovered that the alternative to Athenian imperial democracy was Spartan oligarchic domination. And neither option, it turned out, was freedom. With the fall of Athens as the dominant Greek power, the stage was cleared for the most intellectually extraordinary episode in the history of ancient civilization, and for the man who stands at the center of our story, the Hellenistic period, which properly begins with Alexander the Great's campaigns in 336 BCE, but whose intellectual roots stretch back through the 4th century BCE, was the era in which Greek science, philosophy, and engineering reached heights that would not be surpassed for nearly 2,000 years. And nowhere in the Greek world was this genius more concentrated, more practically applied, more directly connected to the question of survival and defense than in the great city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great, assumed the Macedonian throne in 336 from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India, covering approximately 2 million square miles and encompassing dozens of distinct civilizations, languages, and religious traditions. The military genius that accomplished this was real and extraordinary. His victories at Granicus in 334 BCE, Issus in 333 BCE, and Gaugamela in 331 BCE against the Persian forces of Darius III, represent some of the most brilliant tactical performances in the history of warfare, combining cavalry, infantry, and combined arms coordination in ways that would not be replicated until the military theorists of the 18th century CE began studying his campaigns in deliberate detail. But the more lasting consequence of Alexander's conquests was not military, but cultural. The fusion of Greek intellectual traditions with the enormous accumulated knowledge of Persia, Egypt, Babylon, and India produced what historians call the Hellenistic world, a civilization that was Greek in language and in its fundamental intellectual frameworks, but cosmopolitan, diverse, and far more scientifically ambitious than the classical Greek city-states had ever managed to be. The greatest achievement of the early Hellenistic period was the foundation of Alexandria in Egypt in 331 BCE, and more specifically, the creation of the Library of Alexandria, and its attached research institution, the Mycenaean, under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty that inherited Egypt after Alexander's death. At its peak in the 3rd century BCE, the Library of Alexandria contained between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls, the equivalent of the entire written knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, gathered in one place and made available to the scholars who lived and worked at the Mycenaean as pensioners of the Ptolemaic kings. Euclid, who worked at Alexandria around 300 BCE, wrote the Elements, the most successful mathematics textbook in the history of the world, used in some form continuously from its composition to the 20th century. Eratosthenes, the librarian of Alexandria around 240 BCE, calculated the circumference of the earth with an accuracy that, depending on which ancient unit of measurement he was using, is either almost exactly correct or off by only about 2%. An achievement so far beyond what most people expect of ancient science that it genuinely stops modern readers cold when they encounter it for the first time. Aristarchus of Samos, working in the 3rd century BCE, proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun, and not the other way around. 18 centuries before Copernicus would make the same argument, and while ancient scientists mostly rejected Aristarchus's model, the fact that it was proposed at all tells us something fundamental about the intellectual ambition of Hellenistic science. It was in this context, this explosion of scientific inquiry, this accumulation of mathematical and physical knowledge, this culture in which the manipulation of natural forces for practical purposes was understood to be not only possible, but admirable, that Archimedes of Syracuse grew up, studied, and developed the genius that made him the greatest engineer and mathematician of the ancient world. Archimedes was born in Syracuse, Sicily, around 287 BCE. He was, by some accounts, related to the tyrant Hiero II, who ruled Syracuse at the time, and he spent time in Alexandria studying with the successors of Euclid before returning to Syracuse, where he spent the rest of his life, approximately 75 years of the most productive scientific thinking in ancient history. His mathematical achievements alone would justify his reputation. He calculated an approximation of pi accurate to within 0.0002 of the true value, using a method of exhaustion that is genuinely close to integral calculus, which was not formally invented until Leibniz and Newton more than 1800 years later. He calculated the volume of a sphere and demonstrated that the ratio of a sphere's volume to the volume of the cylinder that contains it is exactly 2 to 3. A result he considered so beautiful that he reportedly requested a sphere within a cylinder to be carved on his tombstone. And when the Roman general Marcellus, after capturing Syracuse, sent a man to find Archimedes' grave, the tomb was identified by exactly this carving. He wrote treatises on floating bodies, centers of gravity, the lever, and the spiral curve that bear his name. And in each of these fields, his work was so far ahead of his contemporaries that many of his results were not rediscovered until the Renaissance, but it was the mechanical inventions attributed to Archimedes that captured the ancient imagination, and that remain the most immediately relevant to our story. The Archimedean screw, a helical device for lifting water that is still used in irrigation systems today, was reportedly invented by Archimedes to drain the bilges of a massive ship he was helping to design for Hiero II. The story of Archimedes and the lever, "Give me a place to stand and a fulcrum, and I will move the earth," is probably apocryphal as literally stated, but it preserves a genuine Archimedean insight about mechanical advantage that he formalized in his treatise on the equilibrium of planes. And then there are the war machines. When the Roman Republic's forces arrived before Syracuse in 214 BCE, the beginning of what would become a 2-year siege that represents one of the most remarkable episodes of defensive engineering in the history of ancient warfare. Archimedes, then approximately 73 years old, turned his entire intellectual capacity to the problem of how to destroy ships and kill Roman soldiers at a distance. And what he produced changed the history of siege warfare permanently. The Roman general Marcus Claudius Marcellus brought 60 quinquiremes, massive 5-banked warships mounting artillery, against the seaward walls of Syracuse, along with a vast land army. What he encountered was something that no Roman general had faced before: a defensive system conceived and built by a single genius who understood the physics of force, leverage, and projectile motion better than any living person. Archimedes had designed and installed artillery, both catapults that could hurl stones and bolts at ships and soldiers at long range, and closer range weapons that could be adjusted in angle to drop projectiles directly onto ships attempting to approach the walls. But the most extraordinary weapons were the crane machines, devices that, according to ancient accounts preserved by Plutarch and Polybius, could reach over the walls of Syracuse, clamp onto a Roman warship with an iron hand, lift the bow of the ship out of the water, and then either hold it vertical until the crew slid out or drop it suddenly so that it capsized and sank. Whether these machines worked exactly as described, or whether ancient authors embellished the story, is a question historians continue to argue. But there is no argument about the basic fact: Marcellus's direct assault on Syracuse's seaward walls failed completely. His fleet suffered significant casualties without making any progress, and the general, who had previously been one of Rome's most successful commanders, was reduced to sitting outside the city in a state of baffled, furious impotence, reportedly making bitter jokes about Archimedes using our ships to ladle seawater, and asking whether they were going to go on indefinitely being beaten by one old man. And this is the detail that connects most directly to the central experiment of our story. There is the question of the heat ray. Plutarch, writing around 100 CE, describes among the devices Archimedes used to defend Syracuse a weapon that concentrated sunlight to set fire to Roman ships. His account is not the only one. The later authors Galen and Anthemius of Tralles also mention a burning mirror weapon, and the 6th century CE historian Xenares gives a relatively detailed description of Archimedes arranging mirrors at angles to focus reflected sunlight onto approaching ships. Modern skeptics have argued that such a weapon is physically implausible, that the diffusion of sunlight over distance makes it impossible to concentrate enough thermal energy to ignite wood before the target moves out of range. Ancient believers have argued that no one in antiquity would have invented a story this specific without some physical basis. And for 15 centuries, the argument remained unresolvable, until a Greek engineer in 1973 decided that the only way to settle it was to actually try. Yet before Archimedes could finish his work, the city of Syracuse fell, not through any failure of its defenses, but through the oldest vulnerability in human affairs: a festival and a traitor. In 212 BCE, during the celebration of the festival of Artemis, Roman soldiers found, or were shown, a weak point in Syracuse's walls and entered the city. Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier against the explicit orders of Marcellus, who wanted the mathematician taken alive. Ancient accounts give different versions of the death. One has him killed while working on a mathematical diagram, refusing to move until he had finished his calculations. Another has him carrying mathematical instruments that a soldier mistook for gold. But all versions agree on one detail. Marcellus, when he heard of the death, was grieved and enraged, and honored Archimedes with a proper burial, finding and restoring the tomb that Cicero would rediscover a century and a half later. This instability in Greek political power, city by city falling to Rome, continued until the entire eastern Mediterranean was reorganized under Roman authority, and the free Greek polis became a memory. The Roman absorption of the Greek world was one of the most consequential cultural encounters in the history of civilization, and it produced one of history's most famous paradoxes, captured by the poet Horace in a single line: Graecia captiferum victorum cepit. Conquered Greece captured its fierce conqueror. Rome defeated Greece militarily, absorbed its territory, taxed its people, and governed its cities, but Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek science, Greek art, and Greek architecture so completely colonized Roman elite culture that within 2 centuries of the conquest, every educated Roman read, wrote, and thought in Greek as fluently as in Latin. Roman temples were built on Greek models. Roman philosophy was almost entirely derived from Greek sources, and the libraries of wealthy Romans contained copies of Archimedes' treatises, alongside volumes of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and Euripides. The rise of Roman dominance in the Greek world was not a sudden conquest, but a gradual process that accelerated dramatically under the Republic's expansion in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. The general Lucius Aemilius Paulus defeated the Macedonian king Perseus at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, effectively ending Macedonian independence and bringing Greece under Roman supervision. In 146 BCE, the Roman general Lucius Mummius destroyed the ancient city of Corinth so thoroughly, slaughtering its male population and selling its women and children into slavery, that the city was not rebuilt for a century, and Greek observers understood the message clearly. This was not a partnership. The Roman general Lucius Cornelius Sulla sacked Athens in 86 BCE, stripping the city of its bronze and marble masterpieces to decorate Roman estates. And the cultural vandalism of these years represents one of the greatest losses in the history of ancient knowledge. Statues, paintings, and perhaps scrolls from the Athenian philosophical schools that we will never recover. Yet under the Roman Empire, particularly during the Pax Romana, established by Augustus Caesar after 31 BCE, the Greek intellectual tradition not only survived, but flourished in new forms. The Roman Empire, at its maximum extent under Trajan in 117 CE, covered approximately 5 million square kilometers, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east and the Sahara in the south. The largest political unit in the Western world until the British Empire. And within this vast administrative entity, Greek remained the working language of the eastern half of the empire, the language of commerce, of philosophy, of medicine, and of the educated classes from Egypt to Syria, to Asia Minor, to Greece itself. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, designed and described a steam-powered device, the Aeolipile, that is functionally the world's first steam engine, powered by steam pressure rotating a sphere through reaction jets, a concept that would not be productively developed for another 16 centuries. Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, produced his Almagest, the comprehensive astronomical treatise that organized and extended all previous Greek astronomical knowledge into a unified geocentric model of the solar system, and his geography, which collected all known geographical information into a map of the world that remained the standard reference in both Europe and the Islamic world for over 1,000 years. The single greatest achievement of the Roman period in terms of its relevance to our story was the preservation and transmission of Archimedes' own written works. The Roman general Marcellus, after capturing Syracuse, reportedly had Archimedes' mechanical devices brought to Rome, where they were exhibited as curiosities, and copies of Archimedes' mathematical treatises were made and preserved in Roman libraries. Cicero, who served as a minor official in Sicily in 75 BCE, found and restored Archimedes' tomb, which had fallen into obscurity, an act of intellectual piety that tells us something important about how the Romans valued the Greek mathematician, even while they could not quite match him. The mathematician Pappus of Alexandria in the 4th century CE cited Archimedes' mechanical works extensively, preserving information about devices and principles that might otherwise have been lost. And it was through this chain of citation and copying, fragile, incomplete, subject to the errors of generations of scribes, that Archimedes' ideas survived the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the dark ages of European history to eventually reach the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age and the European Renaissance. But the collapse was coming. The Roman Christianity, which redirected enormous intellectual and material resources from the secular Greek philosophical tradition toward theological debate and the preparation of souls for an afterlife. The Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 CE, when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, without even bothering to replace him. A gesture of almost contemptuous indifference that captures perfectly how completely the institutional authority of the Western Empire had decayed. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, survived for another 1,000 years as what we call the Byzantine Empire, and it was in the libraries of Constantinople and later in the libraries of the Islamic caliphates that the scientific and philosophical inheritance of ancient Greece, including whatever record survived of Archimedes' heat ray, was preserved against the long barbarism of the medieval centuries. Then from the desert of Arabia, a new force emerged, one that would carry the torch of Greek science further and more faithfully than anyone in the dying Roman world might have imagined possible. The prophet Mohammed died in 632 CE, and within a century of his death, the Islamic Caliphate had expanded from the Arabian Peninsula to encompass Spain in the west and the borders of India in the east, absorbing in the process the Persian Empire, the Byzantine territories of Egypt and Syria and North Africa, and dozens of other civilizations with their accumulated libraries, their scientific traditions, their architectural knowledge, and their mathematical heritage. The speed of this expansion, unprecedented in the history of the world to that point, has obscured for many people what followed it, which was one of the most extraordinary episodes of scientific and philosophical inquiry in the history of human civilization. The Islamic Golden Age, centered on the Abbasid Caliphate with its capital at Baghdad, which from the 8th through the 13th centuries CE served as the primary custodian and extender of the Greek scientific tradition that Rome had partially preserved, and partially allowed to decay. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who ruled the Abbasid Caliphate from 786 to 809 CE from his capital at Baghdad, a city that at its peak contained perhaps 1 million people and was almost certainly the largest city in the world outside of China, established the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, as a center of translation, scholarship, and original research that was explicitly modeled on the Library of Alexandria and was in some ways even more ambitious under Harun and his son Al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833 CE, and took an even more active personal interest in science and scholarship. Teams of translators worked systematically through the entire corpus of Greek scientific and philosophical literature available in the Caliphate's libraries, translating Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, and crucially Archimedes into Arabic, adding their own commentaries and extensions, and making this material available to a scholarly community that spanned from Spain to Central Asia. The single greatest achievement of the Islamic Golden Age in terms of its relevance to our story about light and optics was the work of Ibn al-Haytham, known in the Latin West as Al-Hazan, who worked in Cairo around 1000 CE under the patronage of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, and produced his Book of Optics, a work so comprehensive and so rigorous in its treatment of the physics of light that it remained the definitive text on the subject for 600 years, directly influencing Roger Bacon, Kepler, Descartes, and Newton. Ibn al-Haytham was the first person in the history of science to correctly explain how human vision works, not by rays emanating from the eye, as both Euclid and Plato had believed, but by light entering the eye from external objects, and his analysis of reflection and refraction, of the geometry of curved mirrors and lenses, of the camera obscura, and the phenomenon of atmospheric refraction that causes stars to appear higher in the sky than they actually are, represents a body of work that is genuinely Archimedean in its combination of mathematical rigor and physical insight. His treatment of burning mirrors, concave mirrors that focus parallel light rays to a single point, is thorough, geometrically precise, and completely correct, and it would have been available to any Islamic or later European scholar who wanted to understand whether Archimedes' legendary weapon was physically feasible. The mathematician and scholar Anthemius of Tralles, who was actually a 6th century Byzantine, and therefore technically outside the Islamic Golden Age proper, but transmitting Greek knowledge into the tradition that the Islamic scholars inherited, wrote a treatise on burning mirrors, Peri Paradoxon Mechanism, that explicitly discusses Archimedes' use of concentrated sunlight against Roman ships, and provides a geometrical analysis of how such a weapon might have functioned. Anthemius proposes that Archimedes used hexagonal mirrors to reflect and concentrate sunlight onto a target, and his analysis, even if his specific proposal about the mirror configuration is not the only possible interpretation, demonstrates that Greek and Byzantine scholars took the heat ray seriously as a physical possibility, not merely as a legend, and that the mathematics of burning mirrors was well understood in the classical and post-classical world. The Islamic scholars extended this tradition with characteristic rigor. The mathematician Al-Kindi in the 9th century CE wrote a comprehensive treatise on geometric optics that included analysis of burning mirrors. The physicist and mathematician Ibn Sahl in the 10th century CE discovered what we now call Snell's law of refraction, the precise mathematical relationship governing how light bends when it passes from one medium to another. Independently of the European rediscovery of the same law 6 centuries later, and the Moroccan scholar Ibn Rushd, known in Europe as Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle were so authoritative that Dante, in the Divine Comedy, calls him simply the commentator, helped transmit Aristotelian physics, including Aristotle's discussion of optics and the properties of light, into the European scholastic tradition in a form that directly influenced the European scientific revolution. Yet the Islamic Golden Age came to a catastrophic end in 1258 CE, when the Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, besieged and then sacked Baghdad in a week of violence so extreme that ancient Islamic scholars claimed the Tigris River ran black with the ink of burned books for days afterward. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed. Between 200,000 and 800,000 people were killed, according to various sources. The House of Wisdom was destroyed, and the accumulated scholarship of 5 centuries was either burned or scattered. That any of it survived was a function of the copies that had already been made and distributed across the Islamic world and into the libraries of the Byzantine Empire and the newly literate European universities. Copies that would eventually fuel the European Renaissance and make possible the recovery of Archimedes, complete surviving works in forms that scientists could actually study, test, and apply. This instability in the transmission of knowledge continued through the medieval centuries until European scholars, rediscovering their classical inheritance, began once again to ask the questions that Archimedes had first posed. And one of the most persistent questions was whether the heat ray was real. The European Renaissance began, in part, as an act of recovery, a reaching back through the rubble of the medieval centuries to grasp the intellectual achievement of antiquity and haul it forward into a new age. The humanist scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries, working in the libraries of Italian city-states and in the collections assembled by wealthy patrons who understood that ancient manuscripts were the most valuable objects in the world, systematically hunted down, copied, translated, and disseminated Greek and Latin texts that had survived in Byzantine or Islamic libraries. The Florentine merchant and scholar Giovanni Orispa returned from Constantinople in 1423 with 238 Greek manuscripts, one of the greatest single hauls of classical knowledge in the history of scholarship. And among the works that came west through channels like this were the surviving treatises of Archimedes. The first printed edition of Archimedes' works in Latin, published in Basel in 1544, made his mathematical and physical discoveries accessible to European scientists for the first time in a convenient, reproducible form. And the impact was immediate and profound. Galileo Galilei explicitly credited Archimedes as his primary intellectual ancestor, adopting the Archimedean method of analyzing physical phenomena through rigorous geometry rather than purely verbal Aristotelian logic. The Dutch mathematician Simon Steven, working in the late 16th century, developed the theory of statics, the physics of forces in equilibrium. By extending Archimedes' principles, the English mathematician John Wallis, working in the 17th century, developed methods for calculating areas under curves that were direct extensions of Archimedean exhaustion methods. In short, the rediscovery of Archimedes did not merely add one more ancient scientist to the canon. It helped trigger the scientific revolution. And the question of the heat ray, of course, came with the rediscovery. Every Renaissance scholar who read the accounts in Plutarch, Xenarus, and Anthemius faced the same question. Was this physically possible? The French mathematician René Descartes, who in 1637 published his discourse on the method as a preface to 3 scientific essays, one of which, the Dioptrique, provided the first correct mathematical treatment of lenses and curved mirrors in the Western tradition, addressed the heat ray question directly, and his conclusion was essentially skeptical. He doubted that mirrors of the quality available to Archimedes could have been accurately enough shaped and positioned to achieve the claimed thermal effect. Descartes was a rigorous thinker, but he was reasoning theoretically from principles rather than experimentally from trial. And his skepticism, influential as it was, did not actually settle the question. The most celebrated attempt to resolve the controversy before the 20th century came from the French naturalist and polymath Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, who in 1747 constructed an array of 168 flat mirror segments and used them to ignite wood at a distance of approximately 60 meters. Buffon's experiment was a success. He demonstrably set wood on fire at a distance using reflected sunlight, but it was criticized on several grounds. His mirrors were of much higher quality than anything available in antiquity. His array was more precisely engineered than ancient technology could have managed, and the conditions under which he conducted his experiment may have been unusually favorable in terms of solar intensity and absence of wind. Buffon himself was primarily interested in demonstrating that concentrated sunlight could in principle set fire to objects at a distance. As a contribution to the broader scientific discussion of burning mirrors, not specifically in recreating or validating the Archimedean weapon, his experiment answered one question while leaving the specifically historical question. Could Archimedes have done this with ancient technology in the specific conditions of the harbor of Syracuse in 212 BCE? Still open, the 19th and early 20th centuries brought no more definitive resolution. The German scholar Hermann Diels, who produced the standard modern edition of the ancient philosophical and scientific fragments, noted the heat ray accounts without committing himself strongly to their historicity. The British classicist A.W. Lawrence, the brother of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, wrote in 1946 a careful analysis of the ancient accounts that concluded the heat ray story was most probably a later addition to the Archimedes legend, embellished by admirers who wanted to make his genius seem even more comprehensive than it already was. The American physicist E.J. Dijksterhuis, who produced in 1956 one of the finest modern studies of Archimedes, treated the heat ray accounts with scholarly agnosticism, neither affirming nor denying, noting the physical issues without resolving them. And so the question remained, tantalizing and unresolved, as the first half of the 20th century gave way to the second. And as a Greek engineer named Ioannis Sakkas began asking himself whether 2,000 years of theoretical debate had been asking the wrong question, then from the engineering laboratories and workshops of modern Athens, the answer came not from a library, but from a beach. Ioannis Sakkas was not a classical scholar. He was not a historian of ancient science. He was not, primarily, a physicist or a mathematician in the academic sense. He was an engineer, a practical man, a builder, the kind of thinker who distrusts theoretical arguments about what is and is not possible when the actual question is one that can be settled by building something and trying it. He was born in Greece in 1907 and spent his professional life in the kind of applied engineering that leaves no famous papers, no celebrated treatises, no portraits in the histories of science. He designed things, fixed things, made things work. But in the early 1970s, Sakkas became fascinated by the Archimedes heat ray controversy, and his reaction to the 2-millennia-old debate was characteristically direct. Stop arguing about whether it could have worked and find out whether it works. The approach Sakkas took to the problem was elegant in its simplicity and rigorous in its attention to the specific historical constraints. The central question was not whether burning mirrors in general could ignite distant targets. Buffon had answered that with his elegant 1747 experiment. The specific historical question was whether the kind of mirrors that might have been available in ancient Syracuse in 212 BCE. Bronze mirrors, not optical glass, not precisely silvered modern reflectors, but polished, very different experimental design. Sakkas began by researching the specific optical properties of polished bronze. The reflectivity of polished bronze, the percentage of incident light that a polished bronze surface reflects rather than absorbs, is a measurable physical quantity, and it is substantially lower than the reflectivity of modern silvered glass mirrors. Modern front silvered mirrors reflect approximately 90% or more of incident light. Polished bronze, even at its best, reflects only about 60 to 70%. A significant difference when you are trying to concentrate solar energy to achieve ignition temperatures. This finding did not discourage Sakkas, but it sharpened his experimental design. If he was going to use bronze mirrors, he needed to think carefully about how many mirrors were necessary and how they needed to be aimed and coordinated. The mirror size was also a crucial variable. Historical sources do not give precise dimensions for the mirrors Archimedes supposedly used, and Sakkas had to make judgments based on what was plausible for ancient manufacture and military logistics. He settled on mirrors approximately 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, roughly the size of the large bronze mirrors that ancient Greek warriors actually carried as part of their personal equipment. Mirrors used for signaling, for personal grooming, and in some cases for dazzling enemies. This was not an arbitrary choice. It connected the proposed weapon directly to existing military equipment, meaning that no exotic manufacturing process was required. Any Greek city with a population of adult male soldiers, equipped with standard bronze mirrors, might in principle have assembled Archimedes' weapon from materials already on hand. The number 70 was not chosen arbitrarily either. Sakkas made his calculation based on the geometry of the problem. The target, a wooden vessel representing an ancient warship, would be floating in the harbor at a distance of approximately 50 to 100 meters from the city walls, a distance consistent with ancient accounts. At this distance, each individual mirror would project a roughly oval patch of reflected sunlight, approximately 1 meter wide and 2 meters long, onto the target surface. And the mirrors could not be perfectly parallel because each one needed to be aimed individually to place its reflected patch on the same point. The question was how many of these imperfectly coordinated, modestly reflective bronze mirrors were needed to concentrate enough solar energy at the target point to raise the temperature of treated wood that would have been tar-coated or pitch-soaked, as ancient warships invariably were, to its ignition temperature of approximately 300 degrees Celsius within a reasonable time. Sakkas did the calculation, got approximately 70, and went to the Greek Navy for help. The experiment took place in 1973 at the Skaramagas naval base near Athens, and the specifics of that afternoon, as reconstructed from photographs, eyewitness accounts, and Sakkas's own published descriptions, have a quality of almost theatrical drama. 70 Greek sailors were lined up along a dock, each holding a flat, bronze-coated mirror, approximately the same size as the mirrors Sakkas had specified in his calculations. The target was a wooden vessel, a rowboat or small motorboat. The accounts differ slightly on the exact type. Painted with tar, the standard waterproofing material of ancient shipbuilders, floating approximately 50 meters away in the harbor. The experimental protocol was straightforward. At the signal, all 70 sailors aimed their mirrors at the same point on the target vessel and held them as steady as they could. What happened next ended 2,000 years of controversy in approximately 10 seconds. The wooden vessel burst into flames. This is not a careful, qualifying academic sentence. The tar-coated wood did not slowly smolder, did not gradually heat up over several minutes in a way that might have been operationally impractical in an actual battle. It caught fire quickly, dramatically, in a time frame so short that observers present at the experiment described the result as shocking, even though they had come there specifically expecting to see it happen. The thermal energy, concentrated by 70 bronze-coated mirrors, all aimed at the same point from a distance of 50 meters, was sufficient to raise the surface temperature of tar-coated wood to ignition temperature in seconds. And the result was fire. Real, practical, battle-relevant fire of exactly the kind described in ancient accounts of the siege of Syracuse. Sakkas published his results, announced his conclusion. Archimedes' heat ray was physically feasible with ancient technology, and waited for the scientific community's response, which turned out to be considerably more complicated than the experiment itself. The objections raised by skeptics in the years following Sakkas's experiment were not trivial, and they deserve careful examination, because the history of this controversy is as intellectually interesting as the experiment itself. The first objection was about target stability. In an actual naval battle, Roman warships would not have been floating motionless 50 meters from the walls of Syracuse. They would have been moving, maneuvering, approaching under oar power. And the problem of maintaining the aimed alignment of 70 individually held mirrors on a moving target is considerably more difficult than maintaining it on a stationary one. Sakkas's experiment established that the thermal physics worked, not that the operational logistics of a moving battle were manageable. The second objection was about conditions. The experiment was conducted on a calm, sunny day in the Mediterranean summer, with full solar intensity and no wind. Ancient battles were not always fought under such cooperative atmospheric conditions, and the power of the concentrated reflected sunlight is directly proportional to the intensity of the incident sunlight on a cloudy day, or in the morning or evening when the sun is at a low angle. The weapon's effectiveness would have been dramatically reduced. The ancient accounts do not specify the time of day or the weather conditions during the relevant engagement at Syracuse, which means that the weapon, if it existed and was used, may have been effective only in a narrow window of optimal conditions. The third and most technically sophisticated objection concerns the coherence of the reflected light. The problem with using many separate flat mirrors to concentrate sunlight is that each mirror reflects the entire disk of the sun. A source with an angular diameter of approximately half a degree, rather than a geometric point, and the reflected patches of sunlight from multiple mirrors aimed at the same point do not overlap perfectly, but instead form a slightly blurred composite patch whose size increases with distance and with the number of mirrors contributing to it. At 50 meters with 70 mirrors, each 1 meter wide, the combined spot would be significantly larger than 1 meter in diameter, which means that the total thermal power delivered by the mirrors is spread over a larger area than the ideal calculation assumes, reducing the power density, the amount of energy per unit area, below what would be achievable with a single perfectly focused burning mirror of equivalent total area. This is a real physical limitation, and it means that Sakkas's experiment, while it proved the principle, may have had conditions more favorable than what Archimedes actually commanded at Syracuse. None of these objections disproved Sakkas's result. They qualified it, complicated it, framed it within a set of conditions and caveats. But the wood still burned, and the calculations still worked, and the fundamental answer to the 2,000-year-old question, is this physically possible, remained what Sakkas had made it. Yes. It was at this moment that the story expanded beyond Sakkas and Archimedes, because the 1973 experiment did not merely settle a historical debate, it revived a much more modern question. If concentrated sunlight could be weaponized with ancient technology, what could it do with modern technology? And the answer to that question was already being pursued in laboratories and on desert testing ranges by engineers and military planners who had read neither Plutarch nor Sakkas, but were arriving at the same physical principles from a completely different direction. To understand why Sakkas's experiment worked, and why the question of whether it could have worked was so genuinely contested for so long, it is necessary to go slightly deeper into the physics of concentrated solar energy than most historical accounts bother to go. Because the physics is not merely interesting, it is beautiful, and it connects the ancient world to the modern world in ways that reveal just how sophisticated the Archimedean insight actually was. The sun delivers approximately 1,000 watts of thermal power per square meter of surface perpendicular to its rays at the Earth's surface on a clear day at sea level. A quantity known as the solar constant, actually about 1,361 watts per square meter above the atmosphere, but reduced by atmospheric absorption. and scattering to roughly 900 to 1,000 watts per square meter at ground level in favorable conditions. This means that every square meter of polished mirror surface, capable of redirecting nearly all incident sunlight onto a target, is effectively concentrating 1 kilowatt of thermal power onto that target. And 1 kilowatt is enough to raise the temperature of a small volume of air or a thin layer of wood very rapidly indeed. The question is how much power density, watts per square meter of target surface, is required to achieve ignition of a given material, and how quickly a reflecting system of given total area can achieve that power density at a given distance. Wood begins to pyrolyze, to chemically decompose into flammable gases at temperatures around 250 to 300 degrees Celsius, and it ignites when these gases reach a sufficient concentration in air. Tar, the waterproofing material applied to ancient wooden ships, begins to vaporize at approximately 150 degrees Celsius and ignites at around 300 to 400 degrees Celsius, depending on the specific composition. The thermal power needed to raise a patch of tar-coated wood to ignition temperature depends on the size of the patch, the thermal mass of the wood beneath the tar, the rate at which heat is conducted away from the heated area into the surrounding wood, and the water the ship is floating in, and the convective cooling caused by any wind. These are all calculable quantities, and the calculation, while not trivial, is entirely within the compass of modern engineering thermodynamics. Sakkas's 70 bronze-coated mirrors, each approximately 0.9 meters by 1.5 meters, had a total reflective area of approximately 94 square meters at a reflectivity of 65% for polished bronze, a reasonable mid-range estimate. They delivered approximately 61,000 watts of thermal power, 61 kilowatts, to the combined reflected spot on the target. If that spot was concentrated to an area of, say, 1 square meter, the power density would be 61 kilowatts per square meter, more than sufficient to ignite tar-coated wood in seconds. The actual spot size in Sakkas's experiment was probably somewhat larger than 1 square meter, perhaps 2 to 4 square meters, giving a power density of 15 to 30 kilowatts per square meter at the target, which is still entirely adequate for rapid ignition of tar-coated surfaces. What makes this calculation genuinely remarkable is how close it is to the performance parameters of modern directed energy weapons. The United States military's development of high-energy laser weapons in the early 21st century. Programs like the airborne laser, the Laser Weapons System, LAWS, deployed on USS Ponce in 2014, and the more recent high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance, Helios, system involves power levels of tens to hundreds of kilowatts delivered to small target areas at distances of kilometers. The physics of these systems and the physics of Sakkas's experiment are, at the fundamental level, identical. You are concentrating electromagnetic energy, in both cases light, though at very different wavelengths, to achieve destructive thermal effects at a distance. The differences are in precision, wavelength, atmospheric propagation characteristics, and the engineering sophistication of the delivery system. But the underlying principle is one that Archimedes apparently grasped in the 3rd century BCE with a genius so far ahead of its time that it took the modern military-industrial complex 2,000 years of accumulated scientific progress to catch up with it practically. The optics of the heat ray also connect through Ibn al-Haytham and the European scientific tradition he influenced to one of the most important practical technologies of the modern world, concentrating solar power. The first large-scale solar concentrating power plants built in the Mojave Desert in California in the 1980s under the brand name Solar Energy Generating Systems, SEGS, use arrays of parabolic trough mirrors to focus sunlight onto oil-filled tubes, heating the oil to generate steam that drives electrical turbines. More recent installations, like the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System in California, which came online in 2014, use a tower and heliostat design remarkably similar to what Sakkas used at Scaramougas. Large arrays of individually steerable flat mirrors reflecting sunlight onto a central tower, concentrating enormous thermal power at a single point to generate electrical power. The people who designed Ivanpah had almost certainly never read about Ioannis Sakkas, but they were solving, with modern engineering tools, exactly the same geometric and thermodynamic problem that Sakkas had solved empirically on a harbor dock in 1973, which had been solved theoretically by Ibn al-Haytham in 1000 CE, which had been conceived as a weapon, probably by Archimedes in 212 BCE. The lineage is real, even if the transmission was indirect and the applications were entirely different. The question of mirror quality deserves particularly careful attention because it bears directly on the historical plausibility of the Archimedean weapon. The skeptical argument has always been that ancient bronze mirrors were too imperfect, too distances. This argument underestimates ancient craftsmanship. The Greeks and Romans were extremely skilled metalworkers, and the bronze mirrors they produced for everyday use, and which survive in significant numbers in museum collections around the world, are often of surprisingly high surface quality, flat or slightly concave, with surface irregularities small enough that they give clear reflections of faces for their intended cosmetic use. A mirror used for cosmetic purposes needs a surface figure accurate to within a small fraction of a millimeter over the entire mirror area, an accuracy that is perfectly adequate for directing a patch of reflected sunlight onto a target at 50 to 100 meters. The limiting factor for Archimedean mirrors would not have been surface quality, but rather the difficulty of keeping them polished and free of tarnish under battlefield conditions. Bronze oxidizes rapidly in salt air, and a tarnished bronze mirror might have a reflectivity as low as 30% rather than the 65% assumed in Sakkas's calculation. But this is a logistical problem, not a fundamental physical objection. Mirrors kept polished, as reflective surfaces were routinely kept for signaling purposes, would have been adequate for the weapon's operation. The geometric precision required to aim 70 individual mirrors at the same point on a target 50 meters away is also less demanding than it might initially appear. At 50 meters, a mirror 1 meter wide subtends an angular width of approximately 1 degree, about twice the angular diameter of the sun. This means that a soldier holding such a mirror can aim it to within its own angular width at the target by simple visual inspection. You hold the mirror until the reflected patch of sunlight falls on the target. You adjust its angle until you see and to optimize designs in ways that purely empirical engineering could not achieve. Second, he extended the arsenal of defensive weapons beyond the conventional catapult and crane tradition to include the heat ray, a weapon that was not merely a quantitative improvement on existing technology, but a qualitatively new kind of weapon, one that exploited a physical principle, the concentrated energy of sunlight, that no previous military engineer had thought to weaponize. The cranes that Archimedes deployed against the Roman fleet were mechanically sophisticated devices, but they were recognizable extensions of existing crane technology. The same basic principle of pulleys, levers, and counterweights that Greek architects had used to raise stone blocks to the tops of temple walls for 3 centuries, adapted and scaled for the specific task of grappling and capsizing warships. The catapults he designed were improvements on existing technology, incorporating the mathematical understanding of trajectory and force that Archimedes had developed in his theoretical work on mechanics. But the heat ray was different. The heat ray was Archimedes applying pure optics, the mathematical science of light and reflection that Greek mathematicians from Euclid onward had studied as an abstract theoretical discipline, to a practical military problem in a way that required no precedent and that nobody else in the ancient world thought to do. It was the act of a mathematician, not an engineer. It was the act of someone who understood, at a level that transcends craft knowledge and engineering precedent, that the physical world is governed by mathematical laws that can be exploited once you understand them precisely enough. See Ctesibius of Alexandria, who worked in the 3rd century BCE, roughly contemporary with Archimedes, invented the force pump, the fire engine, the pipe organ, and various improvements to artillery that doubled the range and power of torsion catapults. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, described dozens of mechanical devices, including the Aeolipal steam reaction turbine, various automatic mechanical theater gadgets driven by heated air or falling weights, and a sophisticated survey instrument called the dioptra that was functionally equivalent to a modern theodolite, Philo of Byzantium, working in the 3rd century BCE, wrote detailed technical treatises on artillery, fortification, and siege warfare that survive in part, and give us our most detailed ancient account of the engineering principles behind torsion artillery. These men were all extraordinary engineers, and their work collectively constitutes one of the most impressive episodes of applied science in the pre-modern world. But none of them did what Archimedes did. None of them identified and weaponized an entirely new physical phenomenon, the thermal energy of focused light, and deployed it in a real military engagement, with results so impressive that they generated accounts that survived, debated, and disputed for 2,000 years. This is why Archimedes occupies a unique position in the history of technology, not merely as the greatest mathematician and engineer of antiquity, but as the first person in history to turn physics, pure, abstract, mathematical physics, into a weapon. The modern descendants of that insight are not merely the burning mirrors of concentrating solar power plants, but the entire lineage of directed energy weapons, from ruby lasers to chemical oxygen iodine lasers to free electron lasers to fiber-coupled beam combiners. Every technology that uses the geometric control of electromagnetic radiation to deliver lethal force at a distance. Archimedes got there first, with polished bronze and sunlight, in a besieged harbor on the coast of Sicily, and Ioannis Sakkas, standing on a dock with 70 Greek sailors on a sunny afternoon in 1973, proved it. With the fall of ancient Mediterranean civilization and the long medieval darkness that followed, the thread of Greek engineering knowledge was preserved primarily in fragments, in copies, in the margins of Arabic manuscripts, and the libraries of Byzantine monasteries, waiting for the moment when the world was ready to pick it up again. The history of directed energy weapons in the 20th and 21st centuries is, in an important sense, the story of humanity slowly catching up to Archimedes, rediscovering in the language of modern physics, and engineering what the ancient mathematician had grasped intuitively with geometry and bronze. The path from Archimedes to the modern laser weapon system on the USS Ponce is not direct. It passes through Ibn al-Haytham's Book of Optics, through Newton's corpuscular theory of light, through Maxwell's electromagnetic theory, through Einstein's explanation of the photoelectric effect, and his theory of stimulated emission, through the invention of the maser in 1953 by Charles Townes, and the laser in 1960 by Theodore Maiman. But the conceptual core is continuous, focused electromagnetic energy as a weapon of precision, silence, speed, and infinite ammunition as long as the power source endures. The American military's investment in high-energy laser weapons accelerated dramatically after the Cold War, driven by the recognition that conventional missile defense systems, intercepting incoming missiles with outgoing missiles, were both expensive and fundamentally reactive, always one step behind the offensive innovation they were trying to counter. A directed energy weapon that could destroy incoming missiles, drones, or artillery shells at the speed of light, with a cost per shot measured in dollars, rather than the thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars of a conventional interceptor missile, represented a potential revolution in the economics and physics of defensive warfare. Exactly analogous, in modern terms, to what Archimedes accomplished at Syracuse, turning the physics of light into an essentially unlimited defensive resource. The laser weapon system installed on USS Ponce in the Persian Gulf in 2014 demonstrated that this was achievable at operationally useful power levels, destroying small drone aircraft and disabling the engines of small boats at ranges of 1 to 2 kilometers with a sustained laser beam of approximately 30 kilowatts. A power level, remarkably, not very different from what Sakkas's 70 bronze mirrors delivered to their target at 50 meters in 1973. The difference is in precision, range, beam quality, and the ability to operate under any atmospheric conditions at any time of day. But the fundamental physical operation is the same, and Archimedes, if he could have seen a laser weapon demonstration, would have understood instantly what he was watching, recognized the principle, and probably begun calculating improvements. The connection between the Sakkas experiment and modern Greek national identity is also worth examining, because it is not accidental. Greece in 1973 was in the middle of a military dictatorship, the regime of the colonels that had come to power in a coup in 1967 and would collapse in 1974 following the Cyprus crisis. It was a period of political repression and cultural anxiety for Greeks, and the demonstration that an ancient Greek engineer had invented a defensive weapon of genuine military sophistication more than 2,000 years before modern science arrived at the same concept, had an obvious emotional resonance in a country that was, at that moment, simultaneously proud of its ancient heritage and embarrassed by the inadequacy of its contemporary political institutions. Sakkas himself was not, as far as is known, making a political statement with his experiment. He was pursuing a scientific question that genuinely fascinated him, as engineers do. But the timing and the national context gave his results a cultural charge that purely scientific findings rarely carry. The Greek newspapers covered the experiment extensively. The photographs of 70 Greek sailors holding mirrors in a line were reproduced widely, and the story of the burning boat became a kind of national parable about Greek genius enduring through the centuries, available to inspire and instruct whenever the present moment seemed inadequate to the weight of the past. This relationship between ancient achievement and modern national identity is one of the persistent themes of Greek cultural history, and it connects in interesting ways to the broader story of how scientific and technological knowledge is remembered, transmitted, lost, and recovered across centuries. The Greeks invented not only specific technologies and specific scientific results, but something more fundamental: the idea that the physical world is governed by mathematical laws that human intelligence can discover and exploit. The idea that systematic inquiry, rather than revelation or tradition, is the appropriate method for investigating nature. The idea that the best problems are the ones nobody has solved yet. These ideas survived the fall of ancient Greece, transmitted through Rome, through the Islamic Golden Age, through the Byzantine Empire, through the European Renaissance, and are today the foundational assumptions of every scientific laboratory and engineering workshop on Earth. Archimedes is part of that inheritance, and the heat ray is part of Archimedes, and Ioannis Sakkas is part of the heat ray, and the laser weapon on USS Ponce is part of all of them. The most recent chapter in this story involves attempts by researchers at the Greek Navy's Research Center and at several European university departments of optics and military history to produce a definitive computational simulation of the 212 BCE engagement at Syracuse, modeling the actual harbor geometry using modern hydrographic surveys of the ancient coastline, the optical performance of ancient bronze mirrors, using experimentally measured reflectivity values, the thermal properties of ancient shipbuilding materials, using surviving ancient sources and modern materials analysis, and the organizational logistics of assembling and deploying 70 to 100 mirror-wielding soldiers on specific sections of Syracuse's harbor walls. The simulation has not yet been published in a form that conclusively resolves all the remaining questions, but preliminary results reported in conference presentations suggest that under the most favorable conditions, full summer sun, calm harbor, stationary target, well-drilled mirror operators, the weapon could have achieved ignition of tar-coated timber in approximately 10 seconds at 50 meters, consistent with Sakkas's experimental result, but that under more realistic battle conditions, targets maneuvering under ore power, variable atmospheric conditions, operators with limited training, the effective range may have been reduced to 30 meters, and the ignition time extended to 30 to 60 seconds. 30 to 60 seconds is a long time in a naval battle. A ship's crew, realizing their vessel is on fire from an invisible source coming from the city walls, would have found those 30 to 60 seconds distinctly unpleasant. And the psychological effect of the weapon, the terror of an attack that produced fire apparently from nowhere, from sunlight reflected off surfaces that might not even be clearly visible from a ship at sea level looking up, at a city wall was arguably as important as the physical effect. Ancient warfare was as much a psychological contest as a physical one, and a weapon that produced inexplicable fire from clear air would have been profoundly demoralizing to men who understood fire as the weapon of the gods, not of human engineers. Marcellus's troops, already shaken by their failure to breach the walls with conventional assault, and by the losses inflicted by Archimedes' catapults and cranes, would have found themselves suddenly dealing with a completely new category of threat. And the resulting hesitation and confusion, even more than the actual damage caused by fire, may have been the weapon's primary military effect. Archimedes, who understood mathematics and physics, apparently also understood psychology, the psychology of terror in the face of the incomprehensible. Then, from the perspective of the 21st century, looking back across the full sweep of this story, a new and more urgent question emerges. What else did the ancient world know that we have lost? And what would it cost us to find out? The story of how ancient Greek scientific knowledge came to be owned, interpreted, and sometimes appropriated by modern Western Europe is inseparable from the larger story of European colonialism and the intellectual hierarchies that colonialism both produced and depended upon. The process by which Greek antiquity was transformed from a living inheritance shared across the Mediterranean world, claimed by Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Egyptians, Italians, and dozens of other peoples who had lived with its physical remains for centuries, into the exclusive founding mythology of European civilization, is a complex and politically charged story that directly shaped how the Archimedes heat ray question was framed and studied in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the European Enlightenment rediscovered classical antiquity as a source of secular wisdom and scientific inspiration. It did so within a framework that positioned Greece and Rome as the unique origins of the Western intellectual tradition, a framework that implicitly excluded the Islamic Golden Age's transmission and extension of classical knowledge, denied the Greek heritage of modern Greek people under Ottoman rule, and treated the physical remains of ancient civilization as objects to be collected and interpreted by European scholars, rather than living cultural inheritance of the peoples who had maintained continuity with the ancient world. Lord Elgin's removal of the Parthenon sculptures to London between 1801 and 1812, an act whose legality was contested at the time, and remains one of the most debated episodes in the history of cultural property, was the most famous example of this pattern, but far from the only one. The great archaeological museums of Europe, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, were assembled in the 19th century from objects removed from their places of origin in Greece, Egypt, Iraq, and Turkey, and the interpretive frameworks applied to these objects were developed in European university departments, largely inaccessible to scholars from the regions where the objects had originated. The Greek War of Independence of 1821 to 1829, in which Greek insurgents overthrew Ottoman rule and established the modern Greek state, was supported by Western European Philhellenes, Lord Byron being the most famous, who framed the conflict explicitly as a struggle to liberate the birthplace of Western civilization from Oriental despotism. This framing was emotionally powerful and politically effective, but it also imposed on the newly independent Greek state an identity as the custodian of a classical heritage that now belonged, in the Western European imagination, to all of civilization rather than specifically to the Greek people. Modern Greeks found themselves simultaneously celebrated as the heirs of Archimedes and Plato, and pressured to understand their own history through the interpretive lens developed in Paris, London, and Berlin, rather than in Athens. The tension between these two positions, the pride of inheritance and the resentment of expropriation, runs through modern Greek intellectual life like a fault line, occasionally surfacing in controversies over the Parthenon sculptures or the language of ancient history textbooks, but more often present as a background condition, a persistent awareness that the story of ancient Greece is simultaneously your own family story and something that the world has decided it owns collectively. Ioannis Sakkas's 1973 experiment sits squarely within this cultural context by conducting his test with Greek sailors on Greek soil, using equipment explicitly designed to replicate ancient Greek materials, and by insisting throughout his published accounts on the Greek origins of the heat ray concept. Sakkas was doing something that transcended pure scientific investigation. He was asserting the living relevance of the Greek scientific tradition as a Greek achievement, not as an abstract heritage of Western civilization. The fact that the experiment succeeded, that the burning boat demonstrated what Greek genius had conceptualized 22 centuries earlier, gave this assertion a physical concreteness that no amount of scholarly argument could have provided. You could not look at the photographs of 70 Greek sailors and a burning boat and dismiss the Archimedean heat ray as mythology without dismissing what your eyes were showing you. And in doing so, Sakkas connected the ancient and the modern in a way that was both scientifically valid and culturally meaningful in specifically Greek terms. The subsequent international scientific community's reception of Sakkas's work followed a familiar pattern in the history of science. Initial attention and interest, followed by a period of skeptical reanalysis, followed by a gradual consensus that acknowledged the validity of the basic result while qualifying its implications. The MIT and Mythbusters follow-up experiments, whatever their specific conclusions, served to keep the question alive in public discourse, which is itself a form of recognition that the original experiment had demonstrated something worth continuing to investigate. The fact that a Greek engineer conducting an experiment in a Greek harbor in 1973 continues to be cited, debated, and tested by researchers on multiple continents 50 years later is, in its own way, a demonstration of exactly the kind of intellectual endurance that Sakkas was trying to honor. The endurance of a Greek insight across 2.25 millennia of political change, cultural disruption, and civilizational transformation. The modern Greek state's relationship to its ancient scientific heritage has been shaped by this complex history in ways that are sometimes enabling and sometimes limiting. The immense pride in ancient Greek achievement that is a genuine feature of modern Greek culture, visible in the school curriculum, in the naming of public institutions, in the frequency with which ancient Greek thought is invoked in modern political rhetoric, can sometimes function as a kind of psychological capital that compensates for the difficulties of recent history. The Ottoman occupation, the German occupation of World War II, and the associated famine that killed perhaps 300,000 Greeks, the Civil War of 1946 to 1949, the military dictatorship of 1967 to 1974, the economic crisis of 2010, and its humiliating austerity regime. Against this background of modern difficulty, the fact that a Greek engineer invented the world's first directed energy weapon in the 3rd century BCE, and that another Greek engineer proved it in 1973, is not merely a fact of scientific history. It is a statement about Greek genius that transcends chronology, that says something the economic statistics and the political disasters cannot contradict. The challenge for modern Greece, and the challenge for every nation that carries the weight of an extraordinary ancient heritage, is to hold that heritage lightly enough that it enables rather than constrains, to let Archimedes be an inspiration rather than a burden, to let the heat ray be a starting point for contemporary scientific ambition rather than merely a trophy of past greatness. The scientists and engineers working in Greek universities and research institutes today on renewable energy systems that use concentrating solar technology, on fiber optic communication systems whose physics is directly descended from the optics of burning mirrors, on computational systems whose mathematical foundations can be traced back to Euclid and Archimedes, are not working in the shadow of antiquity. They are working in its tradition, and the tradition is alive. And Ioannis Sakkas understood that, and that understanding is why a Greek engineer in 1973 set a wooden boat on fire with bronze mirrors in a harbor near Athens, and changed the way the world thought about ancient science. The very last sentence of that story, the sentence that connects the burning boat in the harbor at Skaramagas to the question of where Greek genius goes from here, has not yet been written, and will not be written today, because the story, like all the best stories, is still happening right now in laboratories and lecture halls and workshops and harbors, wherever someone who has read about Archimedes decides that the only honest response to the question of whether something is possible is to pick up the mirror and aim it at the sun. There is a particular quality to the light that falls on the harbor at Syracuse on a September morning, when the Mediterranean sun is already high enough to be intense, but the heat of full summer has not yet made movement painful, and the water is dark blue-green and calm, and the limestone walls of the ancient city rise from the harbor's edge to a height that puts the wall tops in full, unobstructed sunlight, while the water below is still partly shadowed. It is the kind of light that invites calculation, that makes you squint and think about angles and distances and surfaces, that makes you wonder how much of it you could capture and focus and aim, and what the result would be. Archimedes looked at that light sometime in the 3rd century BCE and saw a weapon. He saw it not with the eye of a soldier, who would have thought of conventional military technologies, and not with the eye of a priest, who might have seen it as the favor of Apollo, but with the eye of a mathematician who had spent decades studying the behavior of curves and the geometry of reflection, and who understood, with a precision available to nobody else alive, exactly what concentrated sunlight could do to a ship at 50 meters on a clear morning. The legacy of that vision extends in 2 directions simultaneously: backward into the history of Greek science and the Greek city-state that Archimedes was defending, and forward into the history of every technology that has since been developed from the same fundamental insight that light is energy and energy can be controlled. The backward direction, which we have traced in some detail through the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, the Greek Dark Ages, the Archaic period, the Persian Wars, the Golden Age, the Hellenistic explosion of scientific inquiry, the Roman period, the Islamic Golden Age, the Renaissance rediscovery, the Buffon experiment, and the long scholarly debate. This direction tells us something about the intellectual continuity of the human project, about the way in which ideas, once formulated with sufficient precision, do not entirely die, even when the civilizations that produced them collapse. Archimedes' mathematical works survived the fall of Syracuse, the fall of Rome, the fall of Alexandria, the Mongol destruction of Baghdad, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, because the ideas they contained were too useful, too beautiful, too precisely right about the nature of the physical world to be allowed to disappear entirely. And the chain of people who copied them, commented on them, extended them, and eventually tested them against physical reality was never entirely broken. The forward direction, from the heat ray to modern directed energy weapons, to concentrating solar power, to the fiber optics carrying this video to your screen right now, tells us something equally important: that the physics Archimedes exploited is still the physics we exploit, because it is the physics of the universe, and the universe has not changed. The electromagnetic nature of light, the geometric laws of reflection and focusing, the thermodynamic relationship between concentrated energy and temperature rise. These were true in 212 BCE, and they are true today, and the gap between Archimedes and the modern laser weapons researcher is not a gap in understanding the basic physics, but a gap in the precision and scale with which that physics can be engineered into practical systems. Archimedes had bronze and sunlight. We have crystalline gain media and coherent emission. The principle is identical, and the principle is Greek, and the Greek is still alive in everything that follows from it. Ioannis Sakkas died in 1982, less than a decade after his famous experiment, without having produced a definitive published scientific paper that resolved all the technical questions surrounding the Archimedean heat ray. What he left instead was something more durable than a paper: a photograph of 70 Greek sailors holding mirrors in a harbor, and a burning boat, and the simple, undeniable fact that it worked. The argument about whether it worked in exactly the way ancient accounts described, under exactly the conditions of the 212 BCE siege, with exactly the mirrors and organization and atmospheric conditions that were present in the harbor of Syracuse on the specific morning when Roman ships approached the walls, will continue as long as people care about history and physics, which is to say, it will continue indefinitely. But the physics of it, the basic, irreducible, experimentally demonstrated fact that you can set fire to a wooden vessel with 70 bronze mirrors at 50 meters on a sunny Mediterranean afternoon, that is settled, and Sakkas settled it, and no subsequent skeptical experiment has undone what he did on that dock in 1973. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, writing in the 6th century BCE, 2.5 centuries before Archimedes, said that you cannot step into the same river twice, because the river is always flowing and you are always changing, and both the river and you are different every time the contact occurs. The river of Greek scientific genius has been flowing for 27 centuries, and the water in it today is not the same water that Archimedes drew on when he aimed his mirrors at Roman warships, and the person standing at the bank is not the same person Sakkas was when he assembled his 70 sailors on a dock in Athens. And yet, the river is still recognizably the same river, fed from the same springs, flowing toward the same sea, illuminated by the same Mediterranean sun that has been bouncing off polished bronze and setting fire to things since before the word science was invented. And the next person to step into it will change it and be changed by it, just as every person before them has been, and the story of what they discover there, and what they do with it, and whether they can defend what matters against whatever approaches across the water, is still being written in a language that began in Syracuse and Athens and Alexandria, and has not yet found its final word, and perhaps never will. And perhaps that is precisely the point, and perhaps the light that never goes out is not the heat ray burning a Roman warship, but the question itself, still alive, still asking, what can we do with what the sun gives us freely, if only we are smart enough and brave enough to aim it right?